Maarten, thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's very early for you and you woke up
Glad to be
early
here.
just for me, so I really appreciate it. I've read so much of your work you've published. We've published a number of your pieces and on so many different topics from overpopulation to climate change, underpopulation to climate change. Recently, you've been writing a lot about Israel, and I know that you recently went to Israel, and I read your recounts of your time there. I wanted to know, have you always been interested in Israel?
It's a relatively new interest, to be honest. It probably started, I can actually date this very precisely, on the 8th of October 2023. So, not the day of the Hamas massacre on the 7th of October, which, of course, I was aware of, but it didn't really surprise me because Hamas is a jihadist death cult, in many ways similar to a lot of other jihadi organizations like ISIS and Al Qaeda and Jabhat al Nusra. But then the day after, or perhaps the day itself, I was becoming aware of some of the reactions from some leftist friends, mostly academic colleagues at the university. And I was completely blown away by that. Like, this really caught me off guard. And before that, I don't really think I had a strong interest in Israel. So I had a very steep learning curve. I've been reading up on the history of Israel ever since the 7th of October, because I wanted to understand where this was coming from. And with this, of course, I mean the obfuscation, the apologetics, and sometimes the outright glorification of the Hamas terrorist attacks. I was aware of this ideology of decolonization or post-colonialism for a number of years, but I kind of underestimated, or I didn't really take it very seriously. I've heard some rumors, for example, at my department, the philosophy department in Ghent, about decolonizing the curriculum because there's too many white males, dead white males in the curriculum. Okay, then fine. I just roll my eyes. I'm not even against that per se, and I'm for diversity, but I didn't really take this ideology very seriously. I also think that nothing much is at stake when it comes to changing the curriculum. I don't mind just discussing more like non-Western philosophers or people with different ethnic background. But then, of course, when it comes to terrorist attacks and like the existential threats to liberal democracy, something really is at stake. And that's really when I decided, okay, I need to understand this ideology. And that's when I started writing about Israel, because no one else was. I mean, if you think it's bad in Australia or the US, like you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, Europe and specifically Belgium is I've never encountered this before. I mean, I've written, as you say, about a lot of controversial topics, like nuclear energy is also controversial, and the population is also controversial. But I'm literally losing friends over this, and so there's this tunnel vision in the Belgian media and in Belgian academia, I would say, is even stronger than even in the Netherlands, and definitely compared to the US. So that's when I started writing about Israel. Yeah, because I still see Israel as a liberal democracy, and I don't understand why people. Well, I do understand it now, because like why people treat Israel as the aggressor, as the country that should shoulder all the responsibility and the guilt for what happened on the 7th of October and afterwards.
Yeah, it's very strange, isn't it, how people have such high standards for Israel and there's such a focus on the Jewish state compared to the myriad of other countries and conflicts in the world. I too am just baffled. I don't get it. And since October 7th, I've had a similar experience. I've just had to learn more because it didn't make sense to me. And it's just been so much learning. And I too have lost a lot of friends. Would you say that this has been the most
Oh yeah,
controversial
by a
topic
long
that
stretch.
you've broached?
I mean,
The most
I'm not
taboo?
a I've written about Islam before, so that's why I was, for example, I did read the Hamas charter, I think, before the 7th of October, because I've always been interested in Islamic fundamentalism. Like, my academic research started about on pseudoscience, so the difference between science and pseudoscience, but then I kind of expanded that into irrational belief systems in general, and in that context, I became interested in death cults, religious fundamentalism, jihadism, etc. I've been writing about that, which is, of course, in its own right already controversial. I think I interviewed an ex-Muslim, Ali Rizvi, for Quillette as well, and in the Dutch and Belgian media, because ex-Muslims were, yeah, they are a minority within a minority, so they're like oppressed in many different ways, and they did not really get a voice in the Belgian media. So I've been writing about that kind of stuff. That was controversial, but I must say, I mean, it really pales in comparison to what I've experienced after the 7th of October. I don't think I've ever lost any friends over the stuff that I wrote on ex-Muslims. Okay, it was controversial, and some people were saying that I was legitimizing right-wing discourse, or I was a sellout, but this is really something different. I mean, if I'm being charitable, I do understand that. I mean, thousands of people are dying, and of course we shouldn't trust the Hamas figures, but I mean, very conservatively speaking, there will be thousands of innocents. I mean, children by definition are innocent. So I do understand that emotions are running very high. And I also, I mean, I'm going to be even more charitable. I do think that I understand partly, even for people who are not indoctrinated in this post-colonial ideology, why so much attention is focused on Israel. Because unlike many other conflicts in the world, Israel is, of course, still a major Western ally. It's an ally of the US, but it also has a very special status with the association agreement in Europe. It's participating in the Euro song contest, etc. So I understand. I'm even willing to accept that we should hold Israel to a higher standard. I mean, it's pointless to try to put moral pressure on Hamas, because Hamas couldn't care less about our international humanitarian law. They're just a jihadist death cult. So Israel is a liberal democracy. It pretends to be. So that's why we should hold it to a higher standard. But even so, it's it's so extreme. I'm not even pro Netanyahu or anything. I think it's probably one of the worst prime ministers that we've had, and I think everything would be much better if we had a different prime minister. And like, I'm not even talking about the far right goons in his coalition. But yeah, but I could still defend the US against its enemies, despite Trump. I'm also not a fan of Trump, but in spite of Trump's efforts, for the time being, the US remains a liberal democracy, and so does Israel, and that's what I mostly was writing about in my piece. It was not so much about the war itself, which of course is horrific, and I'm really hoping that it ends as soon as possible. But I've written about it before. This was more about Israeli society, because I really think that Europeans, more so perhaps than Americans, need to be aware that Israel is not an apartheid state within the Green Line on internationally recognized territories. Arabs and Muslims have full civil rights. They can run for elections. They hold high positions in civil society, like they're sitting on the Supreme Court. They're doctors, lawyers. To some extent, I think, and this is something that I learned on my Israel trip, Israel is doing a better job integrating its Muslim Arab community than Europe does. There was a gay Muslim influencer, so an Arab Israeli, who told me not just that he was glad to be in Israel as opposed to other Arab countries. Obviously, it goes without saying. You're not going to find any gay prides in Arab countries. I think Lebanon it's a sole exception. But he was saying that he was even glad to be in Israel, even compared to Europe. And I thought about it, and I was like, that's right. I can't really, off the top of my head, in Belgium or even the Netherlands, I can't really think of an openly, like, a visible gay Muslim influencer in Belgium. So this is a guy who participated in the local version of Big Brother. So he's a household name. Everyone knows his face. I can't really. I mean, this would be much more controversial in Belgium. There was a female imam in Germany who allowed gay people in her mosque, or she said something more like inclusive about gay people, and she received so many death threats that she needed around the clock protection from security. So in those respects, I think not only are people not appreciating that Israel is a liberal democracy and not an apartheid state, but all these European countries that are quick to condemn it for apartheid and for Jewish supremacy, etc., actually have some lessons to learn from a country like Israel. Okay, I'm probably ranting a little bit. I'm going to stop now.
No, it's okay. Not to be too cynical, but how much of this do you think is about Israelis being Jews?
Much of it, but perhaps not in the straightforward and direct sense that you would imagine. So this is perhaps some sort of agreement with some of my Jewish friends who, of course, have a very long experience or much more acquainted with anti-Semitism than I am. So, of course, I should also listen to their stories and their experiences. And obviously, it makes a huge difference that Israel is the only Jewish state in the world. But I think when it comes to some of my leftist friends, my academic colleagues, I wouldn't really accuse them of anti-Semitism per se, or at least I think that's not the major factor that turns them against Israel. I think it plays an indirect role in this sense. The really vicious anti-Semitism is mainly to be found in Muslim communities. Obviously, Hamas itself is an extremely anti-Semitic organization. In its charter, it literally quotes that infamous verse from the Hadith, so the traditional stories about the Prophet, about the stones that are calling out to the Muslim warriors, like, there's a Jew hiding behind us, please kill him so that we can just wipe the whole Jewish race off the face of the earth. So that's an anti-Semitic organization. So is Hezbollah, so are the Houthis, so are large swaths of the Arab world, and that's pure anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism in academia plays an indirect role in the sense that the leftists are the useful idiots and apologists for the real anti-Semitism from Hamas and from all these other enemies of Israel. They're not so much anti-Semitic themselves, but they don't understand the ideology of the people that are attacking Israel. From their perspective, and that's, I think, their main ideological inspiration, is this binary between victims on the one hand and oppressors on the other hand, with Western civilization, of course, as the biggest culprit. That's what I'm also writing in my piece. Israel being a proxy of the West, so by implication, it is also complicit in all these things that the West is guilty of, or allegedly guilty of: colonialism, racism, apartheid, etc. And because for them, the world can be divided in pure innocent victims on the one hand and evil perpetrators on the other hand, they will always assume that whenever a designated victim group does something horrible, as what happened on the 7th of October, I mean, many of them are willing to acknowledge that this was horrible, these were war crimes, this was perhaps even genocidal, but they will always apologize for it because they see it as an understandable reaction to the decades-long oppression that they have suffered from the hands of the oppressor group. So because leftists at my university are just not interested in the ideology of Hamas, because they only want to portray Palestinians as these innocent victim groups that are just reacting against whatever is being done to them. It's actually a very condescending way of looking at them. It's like they're just only victims that are only passively reacting to some things that have been done to them, as if they don't have any moral autonomy of their own right, as if they don't have religious traditions of their own right. So that, I think, is the indirect role that anti-Semitism plays, at least at my university. But of course, it goes without saying that if you go to Muslim communities, I mean, look at what happened in Amsterdam only a couple of months ago, mostly. So that this was after there was a soccer match or a football match between an Israeli team and a Dutch team. And there was a literal Jew hunt in Amsterdam afterwards, mostly coming from Moroccan and Middle Eastern taxi drivers in Amsterdam. And they were literally saying, not Zionists, not anti-Israel, they were saying, let's go on a Jew hunt. So that's the real anti-Semitism. And then on the other hand, of course, you have the left-wing apologists who immediately start to apologize for that and start to downplay the thing about Jew hunts, like, oh, it's not really what they mean, they're just frustrated, and that was just a single anecdote, and it's like most of them were not really about Jews, and they're just concerned about all the children dying in Gaza. So that, I think, is the indirect role that anti-Semitism plays at our university. I wouldn't really accuse most of my friends of anti-Semitism, but I think they are useful idiots for the real anti-Semites.
I guess this leads me into a further question, which is more about liberalism and how, Europe in particular, we hear so many stories out of Europe about issues between the native Europeans, whether they be French or German or Dutch or Belgian, and migrants, often young men from different cultures, and how this can, cause issues because while Europeans have, liberal values, a lot of these men don't. A lot of these young men aren't tolerant of Jews or women wearing whatever they want or gay people having these rights. So I guess my question is, do you have any opinions on how we manage that? How do we still stay liberal when dealing with people who aren't?
That's been
liberal?
a long-running debate in Europe, of course, and this is something that I've been writing about for a longer time. So I haven't been writing about Israel in particular, but I have built up a reputation here in my own language community in Belgium and the Netherlands, and sometimes some of these pieces I have translated for Quillette, for being politically incorrect about migration, because I do think, as you spelled it out, there is a real problem with Muslim communities, not with all Muslims, obviously. Some of my friends are Muslim here in Ghent, the city of Ghent where I live. But it is true, not just when it comes to anti-Semitism, but also when it comes to conservative, I mean, that's a euphemism, conservative views about the role of women and about homophobia, or let's call it hatred of gays, because that's what it is. It's not really a fear, it's a hatred of gay people. This is really much more prevalent in Muslim communities, Muslim minorities in Europe, compared to the indigenous or the European population. And this is something that you see in every European country. This is also something that is important to realize. It's not the fault of secularism or the laïcité French model. It's also not the fault of multiculturalism, because there's not a single European country with a significant like immigrant population from Muslim majority countries that has successfully avoided this problem. It happened in Sweden, in the UK, in France, etc., in all these European countries. In some places, it's slightly worse. I think a lot of very facile and diluted explanations about the root causes of radicalism have actually been put to rest in a very tragic fashion after the wave of terrorist attacks in Europe. I still vividly remember that many people said when the first attacks happened in France, for example, like, well, see, they had it coming because, they have this laïcité, they have a very strict separation between the church and the state. They're having this burqa ban, this famous the head to toe covering of Muslim women. So of course they're not banning the veil, but they are banning the veil on schools. So they have these, this is a very specific French model. So that's why the terrorist attacks happened there. But then of course, only months later, the very same thing happened in Canada and in the UK and all these other countries. So every European nation is struggling with this. And as an academic, again, it is extremely, extremely difficult to talk about these issues without being portrayed as a shill for the far right. This is the thing that is really extremely frustrating to me, that like makes me pull out my hair, is this notion that if you talk about these issues, if you investigate them, if you try to tackle the problem, then you will mainstream far right parties. You will play into their hands, which, I mean, any person who has a grain of common sense will realize that that's exactly the other way around. If you stay silent about it, if you refuse to talk about it, if you ignore people's concerns, then you're going to drive them into the hands of these far right parties. So a couple of months ago, actually, I did a study visit in Berlin together with a sociologist who is also blackballed and ostracized and all these other things and cancelled at his own university and elsewhere, because he's one of the single remaining academics in sociology or in the humanities who dares to investigate these issues. So he has some influential papers where he's measuring homophobia, anti-Semitism, and reactionary views on the role of women, and comparing Muslim communities, Muslim minorities in Europe, and Christian or atheists or non-religious communities. And of course, there's a huge difference. But I still remember, this was probably in 2015, that this caused a huge uproar at his own university and in the media, because this was grist to the mill of the far right, and how dare you stigmatize communities like that. I think for a very long time, European politicians have been blind to this issue, or if they have not been blind, they have just refused to speak up about it for fear of offending the sensibilities of the left liberal elites and also of the Muslim communities themselves. I think things have changed for the better in the past couple of years. Anti-immigration parties are on the rise everywhere. Some of them are, of course, very, let's call it, distasteful. I think Alternative für Deutschland is one of the most infamous examples. These are really, I mean, I don't use the word fascist lightly, but these are really extreme right parties that also have roots in blood and soil ideology. But I think what is happening across Europe is that mainstream parties, both center-right and center-left parties, finally realize that they have to present an alternative. That if they keep ignoring this problem, then eventually some right-wing party will grab power. Either it's Marine Le Pen in France or Alternative für Deutschland, which would be even worse. And now you see Keir Starmer, that's the right way to pronounce his name, in the UK, Dick Schoof in the Netherlands, and Geert Wilders as well. Yeah, he's the president of one of those far right parties. He's not really the one that I was talking about. I mean the more center right parties who are moving in the direction of anti-immigration, or at least stricter border control, because they realize that's what the population wants. I mean, luckily, democracies can still reverse course if they really get a very strong and very persistent signal from the population. And I think, and of course, some of my left-wing friends are deploring this, that Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron and all these other people start to sound like the far right, because they're also problematizing immigration. But I think that's exactly what is necessary. If you want to prevent these far right parties from coming to power, we have to also stem I mean, even using the term flood is controversial in this context, because you're dehumanizing these migrants. Of course, I'm not dehumanizing them. I'm just describing a statistical term or like a metaphor. We have to stop this flood of migration, because I think free societies, liberal democracies, can absorb a number of people, a percentage of people that are illiberal, that spit on our freedoms. But that capacity is not infinite. At some point, and this is already happening in some communities in Brussels, in Amsterdam, there's certain neighborhoods where, even though you're still technically legally living in a liberal democracy, you cannot walk hand in hand as a gay couple, for example. You cannot wear a miniskirt as a woman walking around in these neighborhoods, or you will get harassed or catcalled or worse. This is only happening in a couple of cities. That, of course, there's a lot of segregation in European cities. I think we will eventually overcome these problems. I think it's going to cause a lot of, it's going to take years and decades. And I also see hopeful signs, because part of the Muslim community is also turning their backs against religious fundamentalism. They're mostly doing it in a quiet way because they don't want to upset their families or their communities. Some women are getting rid of the veil. Some are still wearing the veil, but they actually are, very much liberalizing and moving away from religion. But if we want to solve this problem, I think we have to at least enforce border control, because if you allow millions of more migrants from these countries, then I think I wouldn't now I think I don't think Europe is doomed or anything, but it would be doomed, I think, if we were to really open our borders. And I know it's a difficult message to bring, but it's unavoidable. The situation that we're living under now is just this cannot persist. We have to do something about it.
Yeah, and Australia's lucky in the sense that we're an island and we don't have any borders, so things are better here. But yeah, I've been to Europe many times and I've seen small towns change. I mean, I visited Calais last year. That was really eye-opening. I stayed at a hotel. No one was there. It was just gendarmes with their big guns, and they were just there to pretty much patrol. It didn't feel like France. It was very, very strange. Yeah, but I guess I just wanted to get back to the topic of ideological capture at universities and what can be done. How can we save universities? There's a lot of discourse about that, but really, what do you think can be done to improve the freedom of speech on campuses for academics, for students?
That's extremely difficult. I must say that even though I'm generally an optimist, or I believe in progress, but in my dark days I have given up on universities. Not all of them, and some colleagues are still doing good work, obviously. But in Ghent, for example, to my shock and disappointment, Ghent imposed a boycott on Israeli universities. They don't want to call it a boycott, but that's really what it amounts to. So they have severed all ties with all Israeli academic institutions. And I was really surprised by that, because I actually know our rector on a personal level. And I think initially he was, sending the right message. Soon after 7th of October, of course, people immediately started to ask for this boycott. And initially he said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to punish universities for the policies of their governments, because many of these academics are actually very critical of their governments. And I thought I was like pretty confident that he would resist the calls for a boycott. But then eventually he caved in because of just the months-long occupation, the protests from not just students, but also like a huge percentage of faculty, and then reports from his own Human Rights Commission. And now basically the boycott is, it's decided, but of course, it's not really implemented yet, because many of these cooperations are within multilateral collaborations within the Horizon. It's like the European frameworks. It's really very difficult to kick Israel out of that. And if you cancel these projects, then you're facing legal consequences, and they probably have to pay millions of euros. Anyway, so what can be done about it? At my university, I think it's basically, hell would sooner freeze over than this boycott would ever be reversed, because we have a new rector now who is even worse from where I'm coming from, because she's even more anti-Israel, and she was the vice prime minister of Belgium until very recently. So she comes from a political background, from a green left-wing party. There's just no way that this is ever going to be. This ship has sailed, and I'm afraid at my university that this battle has been lost. So that's just one example, of course. I mean, there's this general problem of freedom of speech at university.
And I know you wrote about it.
Yeah, that's right.
For us, that you and Jerry Coyne were disinvited from talks at the University of Amsterdam. I'm sure you've had many other consequences from not even being like a crazy Zionist, just like not hating Israel. The only acceptable opinion is to completely hate Israel. It's crazy.
Yeah, you cannot even. And there was an interview in the newspaper with a philosopher, and he was asked a question about my views on Israel. Like, what do you think of Boudry's idea that Israel is fighting a righteous or a justified war? And he suspended his judgment. And even that is no longer acceptable. You have to condemn Israel. You have to say the G word. You have to say it's genocide. Anything else, anything like under that bar is just completely unacceptable. Now, when it comes to Amsterdam, actually, yeah, that's right. You remind me of that incident. It's Orwellian. Yes, it's Orwellian. And I've never encountered something like this before, even when it comes to Islam, even when it comes to migration or nuclear energy. This is really a completely different in a completely different game. But I have an interesting update about the situation in Amsterdam. So as you mentioned, I was deplatformed twice, actually, once on my own, and which was a bit ambiguous. Because there were huge protests at the university and they couldn't provide security, which is something that I can understand. But then the second time around, I was deplatformed together with Jerry Coyne, who's pro-Israel. He's Jewish himself, and so when they became aware of our views on Israel, they decided to retract the invitation. And this was actually 2 days before the event was going to be held. And it is interesting because the reason they provided for the cancellation or the deplatforming, I don't even think that those students who organized it, because it was a student group at the University of Amsterdam, I don't really think that they were particularly anti-Zionist or narrow-minded or whatever, but they were afraid of other students group, of facing repercussions from other students group who would demonize and ostracize and blackball them. So there's a very interesting social dynamic playing here that probably a minority of students, but a very vocal and aggressive minority, has managed to enforce its ideology on pretty much everyone else. There's a lot of preference falsification going on at universities where people are literally telling me behind closed doors or in private emails that, I have to be honest, I'm actually on your side. I also think that this is really getting out of hand, and this demonization of Israel is just wrong. But I don't want to speak out about it because I'm afraid of all the fuss that it might cause. So yes, we were deplatformed at the University of Amsterdam, but a couple of months later, I received another invitation from another student group at the University of Amsterdam. And this time I thought, I'm just going to pretend as if nothing happens and just see what, just it's an interesting experiment. Will they again discover that I have Zionist views, etc.? I mean, also, this was in the media, so I'm pretty sure that they must have been aware who they were inviting. And this time, no problem at all. And nobody even asked me about it. I just went there. There was no protest. So okay, I'm not sure if this is a hopeful sign. Like, if you don't, what's the expression? If you don't wake sleeping dogs. We were putting them in a bind the first time around with Jerry Coyne, because we warned them about it. Like, the first time they needed to provide extra security and they couldn't because of my views on Israel, and they had to cancel my talk. And when the event with Jerry Coyne happened, I wanted to prevent that, and I just told them up front, like, I'm just a heads up, like, we have these views on Israel that are apparently very controversial. If you think that extra security is needed, then please make arrangements. And of course, so in a sense, I was telling them that so if I hadn't told them anything, then perhaps none of this would have happened. So that's why the third time around, I decided that, like, I'm not gonna even mention it, and everything went very smoothly. So I think there is a silent majority at universities among students that is not on board with the pro-Palestinian crowd, but they just don't want to die on that hill, and they refuse to speak up about it, which in a way I can understand. But the unfortunate consequence, of course, is that everyone gets the impression that the whole of the university has been captured by this ideology.
Yeah, at least in Australia, it feels like the heat has been turned down a little bit. In my area, I live in a very Jewish area, and there were actually a lot of attacks. Like, a house behind my house was firebombed and had red paint thrown on it. This was the previous house of a Jewish leader. There were synagogues being torched, things like this. It's recently come out that they weren't necessarily individual anti-Semites doing it. It was more of an organized crime thing. People are debating whether it was funded by Iran or, the bikie gangs had something to do with it. It's there's more to learn about it. But all that to say that the tension here is lower than before, and it's a welcome reprieve. And even looking at our content on Quillette and the videos I'm making and the content we're putting out there, I can see that the Israel content or content about anti-Semitism, it's not as I wouldn't say as popular, but as viral as before. People aren't as obsessed with the topic. And actually, I think that's a really good thing, because, Israelis and Jews just want a normal life and want to go back to being normal members of the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, I don't really have the impression that things are like quieting down here in Europe or at my university. Very recently, there was another occupation. And of course, it's impossible to please these people. They have already boycotted all Israeli universities, but they haven't implemented it yet because it's difficult from a legal point of view. And of course, they're still not satisfied. And I think that the university is hypocritical and that it's just lying through its teeth, etc. I have often wondered, like, what will happen if the war finally ends? And of course, I hope that this, if only this war could be finished in 5 minutes, if only Hamas surrendered and released all the remaining hostages. So this must be the first genocide, quote unquote, in history that can be finished in 5 minutes, if only the opposing army or the opposing combatants surrendered. Will the hatreds, like, will the protests fizzle out then? Will things return to normal? I mean, of course, we already had, even if 7th of October had never happened, the whole problem of Islam and migration was already extremely difficult to discuss in an academic environment. I'm not sure. I can't really speculate about what will happen after the war ends. But I do think it will be a long battle. That even if the protests against Israel are petering out, we still have a huge problem of a left-wing shift in universities. Actually, because I didn't really properly address your last question, there's a lot of research about this, both internationally in the US and in the European countries, whereas society has been shifting to the right, especially when it comes to issues of migration. If anything, the universities have been moving in the opposite direction. And they're feeding off each other. So the more society is shifting to the right, the more universities think that it behooves them to provide like a counterweight, because they have to stand strong and defend their moral values, etc., or human rights. And I don't really know how to break that cycle. So it's very difficult. Sometimes the only thing that sometimes works, it's a bit ironic, but with our new rector, for example, at my university, so she has a very left-wing reputation. And that was working a little bit against her, because there was an election so rectors are elected at Ghent University, because she has a political, she's a card-carrying politician from the Green Party, and her views on Israel and her views on nuclear energy, by the way, she's also anti-nuclear, are very well known. So that's, of course, suddenly she's becoming the rector of university, and she has to become neutral and defend academic freedom. But sometimes what works, especially with these people, if there is at least a perception of left-wing bias, that sometimes it helps for them to put pressure on them to compensate in the other direction. So what I've often encountered with some of these left-wing colleagues, like, ironically, is that they're pointing to someone like me, and there's a couple of other people at Belgian universities, and say, see, it cannot be this bad, because we still have someone like Maarten Boudry working at our university, or Ruud Koopmans, that was a guy from Berlin. So see how open-minded we are. Because part of them deep down still accepts that there is a problem with academic freedom if basically everyone thinks along the same lines. If everyone is voting, like, if only academics were entitled to vote for the general election, then they would probably have an absolute majority of the Green Party. It's just so overwhelming. I don't know a single colleague who's open about his conservative views at my department, for example. And even though, sometimes they're on the one hand, they're kind of smug and complacent about it, like this famous quote about reality having a well-known left-wing bias is from this talk show host. What's his name again? It's not Jon Stewart. I forgot his name. This American talk show host, Stephen Colbert. of course. So that's a very kind of smug and arrogant way of responding. Like, yeah, of course, if you just, investigate the world, then of course you're going to end up with left-wing positions. But then part of them also still realizes that, no, this is actually a little bit too easy. It would actually be good to have some ideological diversity. So they are still somewhat sensitive or somewhat susceptible to this complaint of ideological capture, of ideological groupthink. And that's exactly why they point to people like me and say, I'm not even right-wing, by the way, but they perceive me as being right-wing because I'm challenging some left-wing orthodoxies. And that can sometimes help. So in order to defend them against the charge of ideological capture, it sometimes works in their to their benefit if they at least have a couple of, let's say, call them token heterodox folks, like token right-wing people, in order to say, like, okay, see, we still have some ideological diversity.
On that topic, I see that you've got an upcoming book. I'm not sure if it's been published yet. It's the Betrayal
here,
of
actually.
the Enlightenment: How Progressives Lost Their Way.
Yeah, but that's the Dutch version. Yeah, I haven't translated it yet, but I hope to be able to translate it. I don't have a contract yet with a book publisher, but I've translated some chapters. So that one of the chapters on victim versus oppressor binaries is or like a condensed version of the chapter is going to be published in that book by Lawrence Krauss, The War on Science, probably going to be released next month. I have another essay coming up at Quillette. Actually, it has not been published yet, about how the Enlightenment brings forth its own grave diggers. So the tendency of Western intellectuals to basically spit on their own civilization and spit on the freedoms that they enjoy. That's also drawn from the book. So I started by just translating some chapters, and then hopefully eventually I will be able to translate the whole book. But so it's been out here in Belgium, and of course, I'm getting trashed by all the right the liberal left media. And so it is a very polemical book, and it also has a chapter where I discuss Israel at length. And I probably should say this: I would not have written this book without the 7th of October. Or it would have been a very different book. Even though, I mean, Israel only occupies, it's not even the central argument of the book. I mean, there's this huge chapter about environmentalism and how anti-growth ideology has basically switched camps between the right and the left sometime around the 70s. So, environmentalism and anti-growth ideology used to be very much a conservative position, and then it was endorsed by the left wing in sometime around the 70s. So that doesn't have anything to do with Israel. It's just another way in which so-called progressives have betrayed the Enlightenment. But there is, of course, also a chapter on Israel, and that exhibit as a lightning rod, of course, in the current public discussion in Belgium.
Great. And I think, it just reminds me of how insane it is to not invite Israeli academics, considering that Israel is such a hub of knowledge and technology, that even if you don't agree with the government, to not have those scientists come and share knowledge, it's so anti-enlightenment, it's so anti-science.
And it is, even if you look at some of the projects that Ghent is doing, some of it is really about the very things that these activists care the most about, because many of them, they had two demands when they were protesting and occupying Ghent, is the 1.5 degree climate accord. Ghent has to endorse that somehow, like Ghent is going to save the climate, and a boycott and divestment of Israel. But many of these collaborations with Israel revolve around solutions to climate change, like alternative proteins or green agriculture or all these things, because, as you say, I mean, Israel is a hub of technological innovations and science, and they're destroying these projects just because they want to flaunt their virtue, and just because they want to have this, this pure moral stance that they don't want to have anything to do with Israel.
Virtue signaling. Last question: how did you come across Quillette?
Not sure. It must have been many years ago. Yeah, it just creeped up on me, I think. I became aware of it. I mean, it must have been a decade ago. Is that even possible? I mean, how long does Quillette exist? Yeah. So
a decade
probably
now.
The first piece that I wrote for Quillette was 2017. I think I became aware by just suddenly, after a couple of times, it's like this repetitive, like this name kept cropping up, like, Quillette's interesting. Yeah. The first time I probably didn't know the magazine. Steven Pinker has been writing for Quillette right from the start, I think. That might be a reason, because of course I've been following Steven's work. That might have been the first piece that I read at Quillette. But no, I'm really proud. I should say this. I'm proud to write for Quillette, because I do think that Quillette is now, especially people, since the re-election of Trump, some people have been showing their true colors, and I think Quillette has been very consistent in its defense of liberalism against threats coming from any direction. And some, I'm not going to name them, but some other heterodox outlets have basically jumped on the Trump bandwagon, and or at least remained silent about all the threats that are coming from the right. And I think if you are a genuine liberal, of course, you have to fight liberalism wherever it comes from. So I think and Quillette is doing that.
Great way to end the conversation, I think. Maarten, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, and nice to meet you.